Well, the opposite of women's oppression is what Wollstonecraft is going to call women's rights. What do women have the right to? Okay, well, negatively speaking, women have the right to not be oppressed. And oppressed, again, according to this definition that you see in the middle line of this slide. But more positively speaking, women have the right to unfold their faculties. Unfold their faculties. So Wollstonecraft has what is sometimes called a capacity approach to human rights. And for Wollstonecraft, of course, human rights, the rights of man, as they were called back in her day, includes women's rights. So Wollstonecraft is really one of the early proponents of this idea of women's rights as human rights. But what is the capacities approach? Well, for Wollstonecraft, all human beings, all individuals have a set of innate capacities. They've got capacities for morality, for example. They've got capacities for speech. They've got capacities to care for other people. And most important for Wollstonecraft, all human beings have a capacity to reason. So when you hear Wollstonecraft talking about unfolding their individuals unfolding their capacities, women unfolding their capacities, the idea is women have a potential for reason, which under patriarchal social systems is being squandered. And the idea, like, listen to how this sounds: unfold it, unpack it, allow it to expand, allow it to grow and develop this capacity to reason. Okay, so that's the bottom line of women's rights, according to Wollstonecraft, to actualize the potential that individual women have to unfold their faculties or capacities to reason. Okay, how will women be able to deliver on the promise of their rights? Well, there's only one way, Wollstonecraft thinks. It's by participating in the entirety of society and participating in society as equals. So there's really two components to this idea of social participation. The first is its full participation. What that means is anywhere that men are participating in society, say in the cultural sphere, by writing philosophy or performing in plays, okay, the cultural sphere, or whether we're talking about the political sphere. So men are running for office, and men are voting for candidates who are running for office. Or if we're talking about economic life, where men are owning companies, owning property, accumulating wealth, acting as business people, CEOs, and so forth. Okay, or whether we're talking about the professions where men are doctors, lawyers, okay, all sorts of white-collar jobs, and so forth. Anywhere that men are participating in society, women should have the right to participate too. And the idea is those professions, those activities allow men who have the capacity to unfold their faculties. Okay, so you can see here how the first and the second components are quite closely connected for Wollstonecraft. So that's one thing, because Wollstonecraft reasons that if women are artificially limited to certain sectors of society, say the home, they will have a much harder time finding opportunities to develop themselves and to develop themselves fully. Okay, so that's the full social participation bit, there's also a notion here of equal social participation. And the idea is women have to enter into these fields, these professions. Women have to enter these sectors of society on equal terms with men. It can't be this sex differentiated thing where women are now in the formal workplace, but instead of having the opportunity to become part of management, they are rather getting snacks and coffee for management. You know, the kind of stuff you see in these TV shows about 1950s corporate America and so forth. That's not equal social participation. That's unequal social participation because informally, it's not written out in the, the charter of the corporation or anything, but informally, there's a kind of sexed division of labor where men are doing the more directing and visionary kind of work in the corporation, where women are doing more of the service kind of work and more of the assisting kind of work. Okay, so that's the opposite of what Wollstonecraft is thinking of. Okay, Wollstonecraft would say that her vindication of the rights of women is ultimately a vindication of reason and virtue. So there's definitely, let's call it an external dimension to what Wollstonecraft is saying, because as we just saw, it's really impossible to unfold your faculties fully if you don't at least have the chance to participate in all sectors of society as an equal with men. But what Wollstonecraft actually stresses is the internal side of rights. And what she's saying is the ultimate good of women's rights is, if we're going to talk about benefits, what they're good for. Of course, they're inherently good, Wollstonecraft thinks, but what are they also instrumentally good for? What else can these rights get you? Wollstonecraft would say, well, they allow women, they encourage women to develop their reason and their virtue. So these are very key terms for Wollstonecraft. This is a very important slide, and that's why I've put these two key terms, reason and virtue, in boldface. What is reason? Reason for Wollstonecraft is what makes humanity special. It's what distinguishes human beings from the rest of God's creation and God's creatures. And what Wollstonecraft is basically saying is reason is a distinctively human capacity. So that's just the name she uses for our, let's call it our ability to think. Okay, so really what we've got going on with Wollstonecraft is a kind of three parts of the soul theory. And Wollstonecraft, like Plato, thinks that morality is primarily a question of crafting your soul correctly. Soul craft, you could call it. So you've got to get your soul, your internal house, in order. Okay, so Wollstonecraft says that our rational capacity is often struggling with our passions. And this is the relation here between the first and the second part of the soul. So the first part is reason, the second part is passions. Okay, passions roughly correspond to what Plato would call the spirited part of the soul, but it's a little bit different. With 18th century European thinkers, there was this struggle between reason and passions. Sometimes this was called the struggle between the head and the heart. If you read authors like Thomas Jefferson, you'll see him in his letters talking about my head wants this and then my heart wants that. Okay, so that's reason and the passions. And as you can hear from this phrasing, passions, the primary passions were love and hate. Love and hate. And these were seen as our kind of basic and our motivating drives, our basic and motivating drives. So you can already see there's a little bit of difference here, because Plato basically said the spirited part is the thing that wants honor and glory and to compete and wants to be recognized and win awards. It's a little more Greek, basically. Okay, so reason's often at odds with the passions. Reason has to struggle with the passions. It's often a struggle to be reasonable. Wollstonecraft would say, sometimes you fall in love with the wrong person and you've got to listen to your head and not your heart. And sometimes you hate somebody for no reason, and then you've got to use your rational capacity to see, oh yeah, wait, that person is not scary and my enemy, they're actually my friend, and all that. Okay, so reason struggles with the passion. And then the idea is reason has to help elevate the passions and kind of purify the passions to make our emotional life more reasonable. Because there's this third part of the soul, which is always trying to drag the passions down. And Wollstonecraft calls sentiments, and sometimes she calls them appetites. So sentiments are like cheap, degraded versions of the passions. They're not proper passions. They're more like fake sentiments. So like in a melodrama, or something really corny on TV. It's not genuine love that they're depicting because it's too simplified, because it's a bit maudlin, it's a bit fake. Okay, so love can be degraded into something like mere, Wollstonecraft would say, like spaniel-like affection. Spaniel-like affection. Okay, so, and similarly, love could be degraded by the appetites, this third part of the soul, and instead of a love based on rational esteem and love which is kind of tempered or moderated by reason, what you've really got is just lust, and lust for the body. And, oh, that person's really attractive, and that's, in Wollstonecraft's eyes, that's the appetites dragging the passion of love down into lust. Okay. Reason is super important because reason allows all individuals to be autonomous or independent. And the idea is reason is what allows individuals to make rational decisions about their life. So this is very important because reason for Wollstonecraft is a little bit different than Platonic reason. Because you remember, for Plato, the idea of reason was to get you out of this material world. And there is an aspect of that in Wollstonecraft, especially when it comes to Wollstonecraft's religious beliefs. Wollstonecraft thinks that reason draws us closer to God, and Wollstonecraft thinks that reason was what God gave humanity so that they could live a moral life. Okay, and we'll see some of that argument in a bit. But for now, the point is, reason is the foundation of morality. You can't have moral conduct, Wollstonecraft would say, if you're just, for example, blindly following customs. In that case, you're just imitating what other people are doing. And in that case, Wollstonecraft would say, you're not acting properly like a human. This is coming back to the idea that reason is what distinguishes us from other animals. When you're just imitating what other people do, Wollstonecraft would say, that's just monkey see, monkey do. Okay, so we may have a natural tendency to do that. We may have, an appetite or a sentiment to do what other people are doing, but that's not what makes us kind of morally independent people. A morally independent person, Wollstonecraft says, knows what they're doing, they're aware of their conduct, and they know the principles, the moral principles behind their conduct. A rational, moral individual, Wollstonecraft says, knows what kind of excellences or virtues they want in their soul, and is able to craft a path of conduct which leads to that excellence in the soul. So, okay, reason is in that way the foundation of virtue and excellence. If you took away our reasoning capacity, Wollstonecraft would say you will also take away our moral capacity. And here, I just want to point out that Wollstonecraft is a bit of a moral perfectionist. And here, Wollstonecraft really is pretty close to Plato and a little bit different than Locke. Why do I say this? I say this because Wollstonecraft thinks that the aim of human life is to develop your reason and your morality. And the perfectionism kicks in that Wollstonecraft thinks all of us have got to struggle. We've got to struggle internally against our sentiments and our appetites. We've got to elevate our passions, and we've got to develop our reason. And that, in a nutshell, is Wollstonecraft's, goal of life. Goal of life. And let's say that we are, of course, imperfect beings. We're only human. And we cannot achieve, of course, the perfection that some higher kind of being, say God, could achieve. In fact, Wollstonecraft would probably think that's hubris. That's kind of arrogant of us to think we could achieve that. But that doesn't stop us from striving. We can strive to be more perfect than we are. We can strive for moral perfection, even though we know we'll never reach it. Because again, we're only human. Okay, I want to talk about two things today. Both of them regarding chapters 2 and 3 in Wollstonecraft's Vindication. The first is Wollstonecraft's argument that women are made, not born. And what we're going to see here is a very early version of social construction theory, social constructionist theory. Okay, and then the second thing I want to talk about is what Wollstonecraft calls a revolution in female manners. And this is Wollstonecraft's version of revolutionary politics. To harken back to our lecture on Monday, this is the revolution that she thought the French Revolution left unfinished. Okay, what does it mean to say Wollstonecraft has got a really early version of social constructionism? It isn't to say that Wollstonecraft just in chapter 2 opens the chapter with a line like, well, and that's why sex differences are actually gender differences, and those sex differences, those gender differences are constructed by society. Wollstonecraft doesn't have that language. So just to be very clear, when you see Wollstonecraft talking about sex, she hasn't got this other language of gender and sexuality. Okay, those distinctions, gender, sex, sexuality, that all came in basically the second half of the 20th century. I'm not sure how early it goes back, but that's certainly when those sorts of distinctions started coming into prominence, as did the language of social constructionism. Okay, so she didn't have that language. And when she is talking about sex, you have to remember in your head, just make a note to yourself, that she is also including within that category what we call sexuality and what we call gender. And if you want to put her argument in contemporary terms, what she's saying is much of what we think is sex and biologically rooted is actually gender and socially rooted. Okay, so let's come a little bit closer to Wollstonecraft's own terms. Her argument would be that sex-based behavior, that behavior we see differentiated by male and female, is more the result of nurture than nature. Okay, and I'm saying this is closer to her language because Wollstonecraft has this idea that, yes, most people in her society think that these observable differences between men and women are simply given by, let's say, Mother Nature. Okay, and so when Wollstonecraft is looking around her environment, she is not denying that there are observable differences in the ways that women and men act, dress, hold their bodies, sometimes even think, and sometimes even feel. Wollstonecraft's very basic point is too many people in the 18th century Europe of her time immediately go for nature as the explanation of those differences. So she doesn't deny the differences. What she's denying is that there's a kind of one-size-fits-all explanation for those differences called Mother Nature. So, for example, you could imagine Wollstonecraft looking at a scene like this. And basically what you've got here is two aristocratic men, or maybe, I'm not sure how to interpret this. The guy in the middle is definitely an aristocrat because you can see he's got fancy pants. The guy next to him may be either a junior kind of aristocratic guy or, yeah, I think it's like a junior partner. And then you've got two women who look to be more middle class. And I'm just making that guess based on their dresses. Side note, the side note I gave you got, yes, exactly, his pants. Somebody wrote, you can tell he's high up because of his pants. That's exactly right. Those are fancy pants. Those are aristocratic fancy pants. You can also tell he's high up because he's got a wig. He's got a wig, and all the aristocratic men were wearing wigs back then. Well, the man is standing there rather haughtily and kind of proud, and the women they're turning their faces up, and they're definitely in a kind of position of being more of a supplicant, somebody who is looking to look up to this aristocratic type. And Wollstonecraft realizes this. She knows there are class differences in French societies and other class-based societies. And what Wollstonecraft would say is, yeah, too many people think those class differences are natural. And then she knows there are sex-based differences in the way that men and women, as we just saw in that picture, are holding themselves and behaving towards one another. And she would also say too many people think those are just natural, and they haven't thought through how the very notion of society always includes the notion of artificiality and always includes the notion of construction. It's built right into our notions of what society is. And so here's what Wollstonecraft is going to try and say. She says, I, Mary Wollstonecraft, do not deny that men and women have different kinds of bodies. Nobody is really denying, at least in Wollstonecraft's time, that there is something called, let's call it biological sex. And so we can distinguish two kinds of bodies. Okay, obviously, the more complicated sets of arguments we have around transgender, transsexual, and a number of trans terms, they were not in play in Wollstonecraft's time. The discussion of sex, as I was saying, was a lot less refined and was a lot simpler. So let's just go with what Wollstonecraft is saying for the moment. Wollstonecraft is saying that you can distinguish between two different kinds of body. However, Wollstonecraft would deny that there are two different kinds of soul. There is not men's soul and women's soul. There's actually just one different kind of soul. And any variations we see between individuals, and Wollstonecraft would be very insistent on this point, the variations that we see in, say, personality, in people's temperament, and how they think and how they feel and the kinds of judgments they make, what art they like and all that, those variations all take place within one category. There is no difference in the kind of soul that men and women have What we should really be talking about is just human souls, period. Okay, so the natural differences, Wollstonecraft said, probably pertain most to the body. But by nature, there is only one kind of soul. Sex-based differences seem natural, and Wollstonecraft here is talking about authors like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is one of the big French intellectuals of her time who write, young girls have a natural affinity. They naturally want to play with dolls. This is a very old idea. You can see here it goes all the way back to the 18th century. It may even go back farther than that. I'm not sure how old that idea is. And then Wollstonecraft has got a really simple rejoinder. Okay, Rousseau, maybe you're right. Maybe there is some kind of natural, let's call it an instinct, to nurture young children, because that's what the doll is. It's kind of a child nurturing a child. It's a child kind of playing parent. But Wollstonecraft would say, and here's the but, are you so sure that instinct for nurturing is so confined to women and doesn't belong to men as well? And might there be other ways we can explain why it seems like young girls naturally gravitate towards dolls, but in actuality, what's really going on is that they're being socialized. They're being socialized into liking dolls, into playing with dolls. And here's Wollstonecraft's argument along those lines. This is page 56, if you've got the Penguin edition. That a girl condemned to sit for hours together listening to the idle chat of weak nurses, or to attend at her mother's toilet, will endeavor to join the conversation, is indeed very natural. Okay, and so this is the idea that the female sex, that women and girls are more chatty. Okay, and Wollstonecraft is saying, well, is this any surprise? Because look at the environment. Why? Why does Wollstonecraft think this way? She, the girl, will imitate her mothers and her aunts and amuse herself by adorning her lifeless doll as they do in dressing her, poor innocent babe. This is undoubtedly a most natural consequence. So when you see Wollstonecraft using natural in contexts like this, you've got to put the ironic and the sarcastic scare quotes around it, because Wollstonecraft is making a very simple point. She's saying that if a young girl is being taught and trained to be like her elders, women, that she will naturally try to imitate her aunts, her mothers, and her nurses. And if the idea, the very widespread and unquestioned and the very prevalent idea is that it's the job of women to care for children, well, how is the child going to try and imitate that behavior? Well, she's going to try and find a child or a toy who represents a child to care for herself. So the idea is, in everyday life, there's just a whole lot of what today we would call gendering going on. There's a whole lot of gender socialization. And all Wollstonecraft is trying to do is point to those practices and say, are you so sure those are natural? Here's a more modern perspective on this this whole take. Basically, it's from Sociological Images. It's a website made by sociologists, and the idea is a lot of stuff that marketing genders or corporations gender in order to sell products is actually needlessly and pointlessly gendered. In other words, the gendering has nothing to do with the function of the actual product, but rather it has to do with, well, for one thing, trying to make a profit. And secondly, what they're actually doing, the sociologists would say, the Wollstonecraft types would say, is they're creating these gender differences. So, for example, what does the color pink and calling something sleeping pretty in pink have to do with earplugs? Why would what is the difference between men and women's earplugs? Okay, so you can see the packaging here, you can see the coloring here, you can hear phrases like silky and soft and comfortable. Can you I think you guys can see this. Okay. How do I go back? Whereas you can see right below another example, which is earplugs which are gendered in the opposite way. Skull screws, earplugs, screw them in your ears. These are not comfortable, apparently, and in fact, they're shaped like little screws. It sounds really painful to my ears, but you get the point here. The denial is not that young boys and young girls may act differently. The question is, what is the source of those differences? And here's the deeper argument. Wollstonecraft is arguing that these sex-based roles are, in a way, a kind of professional training, and that this job training starts young. And Wollstonecraft is going to say, if you start training somebody for a job that young, it's going to be like second nature for them. And second nature is not actually nature. Second nature is actually just really good socialization. So Wollstonecraft says, you can see this kind of relationship between professional training and professional traits, between teaching somebody to be a certain way and the behaviors that then you'll observe them performing. You can see that kind of relationship in men. So, for example, Wollstonecraft says soldiers are taught that blind obedience, which for Wollstonecraft is not a great thing, but by which she basically means obeying the commands of a superior without constantly questioning them and saying, well, is what they're ordering me to do the right thing? I don't know. And then agonizing. No, you just do it. You just do it. You receive a command and then you carry the command out. That kind of training, it seems kind of automatic. It seems kind of natural in a soldier. But Wollstonecraft would say, you realize those soldiers had to be trained that way. And that's, this is why you get the proverbial insubordination in boot camp and so forth and all those army movies and so forth, because it's not all that natural. It's not all that natural. We're thinking beings. When people quote, command us to do something, we have a tendency to try and think it through. Okay, and so Wollstonecraft is saying, is that really all that different than what is informally going on with wives? That there are notions that a good daughter listens to her father, and that when she grows up, this good daughter marries a husband, gets married to a husband, and then listens to her husband. Okay, and then if you see wives, say in the 18th century European context, who seem to have that almost like on automatic, or to defer to the husband almost automatically, or to look to husband for guidance or whatever, it looks natural, but are you sure that's natural? Okay, and Wollstonecraft wants to introduce the doubt there. And then she's got another argument. I think this is actually the most interesting argument here. And she says, a lot of people, including Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this intellectual she was making fun of for believing that women naturally are inclined towards dolls, Rousseau says, young girls naturally want to be aesthetically pleasing to men. And that's why they pay attention to their person, by which Rousseau means their body. So the idea is young girls naturally like to dress up and to look good for men, especially for men, and maybe for also other women and so forth. And Wollstonecraft would say, how are you sure that's natural? Because maybe it's job training. Maybe it's job training because maybe when you have a society where the norm of a good middle class life is actually not requiring women to work in the formal economy, where you say that one of the best options for an ambitious young woman is to get a good marriage, and you teach young girls that, you know, if you're from the middle class and you've got the shot to marry an aristocrat and to kind of move up in the class rankings, that's actually what you're aiming for. In other words, if marriage becomes a kind of job and you have to look good in order to get that job, to secure that good marriage, how is this all that different than aristocrats? Aristocrats, both men and women, who are obsessed with their looks, who are always wearing the fancy pants and the powdered wigs and the sensational dresses and the big poofy skirts and all that, because their social status, their job of staying among the aristocratic elite, part of their job is to look the part. Okay, so wives and aristocrats both have attention to their person, attention to their personal appearance as part of the job requirements, and people get trained in that job from a very young age. Okay. Similarly, Wollstonecraft is going to argue that patriarchy, this oppressive system, is human-made rather than God-given. So the first argument Wollstonecraft was providing for this proposal that women are made, not born, was it's nurture more than nature. And the second argument is patriarchal relations are socially constructed, they are not God-given. And now Wollstonecraft is getting into some religious territory, some territory where religious arguments are being used to either support or undermine certain kinds of power relations. So the first thing that Wollstonecraft wants to say is, God does not intend individuals to be submissive in general. And she thinks that God's name is being taken in vain and abused when people say that there are divine rights to kingship, for example, this divine right of kings. Okay, and the idea that God wants all the king's subjects to unconditionally submit, to blindly obey the king, as if there was something special or natural about that person's body, or something special or natural about that person's birth and lineage. But Wollstonecraft doesn't like that argument, divine rights of kings. And then Wollstonecraft just wants to extend the argument into household relations, into personal relations, because she says, if there's not a divine right of kings, and there's no such thing as God-given submission, where in the world do some people think, they don't say it like this, but they basically think that there's a divine right of husbands? So in one way, it's just kind of a rhetorical move. You take what has been established in one arena, let's call it the relation between governments and subjects, and then you extend it into another arena, let's say the relationship between husbands and wives. So it's not God-given that a woman has to submit to her husband. Let's be very clear, though, that Wollstonecraft is criticizing natural submission this idea of God-given submission, she is not criticizing the notion of sex roles. Because once again, as we saw in the last slide, Wollstonecraft does admit that there are at least two kinds of bodies. Let's call them their conventional names, men's bodies and women's bodies. And she thinks that only a woman's body has this kind of power of natural procreation, basically to carry a child, a developing child within it, and to give birth to it, and to maybe breastfeed it, and so forth. Okay, so Wollstonecraft is not denying, for example, that mothers may actually have natural duties towards their children, and that these may be different than fathers' natural duties towards their children, insofar as motherhood has this kind of embodied aspect, and that some functions of motherhood may require a certain kind of body. Okay, so it's not a denial of sex roles, it's a denial of natural sexual submission. But you can imagine Wollstonecraft's religiously informed objector saying, what about all those passages in the Bible where it says, wives, obey your husbands? All those passages in the Bible where it says, wives, submit to your husbands. Okay, so now Wollstonecraft has got to give a different meaning to this term, submission. And then you'll see Wollstonecraft talking about this term on page 48, where she says, if we're really talking about morally independent individuals, these individuals have the dignity of a rational will that only bows to God. So first of all, the presumption is submission is most legitimate when it's to a higher power. Submission between equals, so the presumption is against that. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then there's a deeper kind of theological point going on here, a deeper kind of philosophy of religion point going on here. Because what Wollstonecraft is saying is, when is it rational to submit? When is it when you're using your reason and just thinking about it? When should I submit to this higher power? What does that higher power have to be like such that it makes sense for me to submit? How do I know it's really the higher power? How do I know this is a higher power that should be obeyed and submitted to? And Wollstonecraft she's not directly saying this, but I think the reasoning goes something like this. She says, the reason you obey God rationally is not that God is omnipotent. It's rather that God is omnibenevolent. So to use just more plainer terms, it's not the fact that God is all powerful and all strong that compels us rationally to submit to him. It's the fact that God is all good and all benevolent, all caring for the good of others. That's why you submit to him. Okay, so if God were omnipotent without being omnibenevolent, you wouldn't be rationally submitting to that God. That's a blasphemous notion, by the way, for Wollstonecraft and other Christians. I'm just making hypothetical arguments. In that case, if God were just all strong, but not good, let's say he was all evil, you would just be cowering in fear and scared of being punished. That's not rational submission. It's the fact that God is both all powerful and all good that makes your submission rational. Because you know that what God is commanding, what God wants for humankind, what God wants for you is what's best for you, what's best for humankind, what's best for everything, really, for everything. Okay, now take that example of rational submission. And now take another look at wives submit to husbands, or wives obey your husbands. What is it in the husband that the wife is supposed to submit to. Wollstonecraft is saying it's not the fact that the husband may be physically stronger or more powerful or capable of punishing or, quote, correcting the wife. Those are euphemisms. It's not because the wife could be beat by the husband. What Wollstonecraft is saying is if there is reason and virtue in the husband, and reason and virtue such that the husband is actually saying what's good for the family, saying what's good for the wife and the children and himself, saying what's good for the common good, basically. In that case, the wife, of course, should obey the husband. But this is where you have to keep going with the argument, because if it's really the reason and virtue and the reason and morality that the wife is submitting to, there is no reason that the husband should not equally submit to the wife. Because if the wife is making arguments that are good and making proposals that, if carried out, would be good for the entire family, for the husband, for the child, and the wife, then the husband should submit to that too. Okay, so Wollstonecraft has got to be able to reconcile her understanding of what God wants, which is basically women's emancipation and equality, with these existing biblical passages which are being used as objections against her position. Okay. Wollstonecraft was a rational dissenter. Wollstonecraft was a deeply religious person, and she belonged to a group of deeply religious English people who did not belong to the Anglican Church. These rational dissenters tended to believe in a whole lot of progressive causes. They tended to be for the abolition of slavery. They tended to be against cruelty to animals, and they tended to be in favor of women's equality. Okay, and this in part came from their kind of anti-establishment stance. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, was by definition the establishment. It was the established Church of England. And so these were kind of political progressives and social rebels. Okay, and they supported their progressive politics with these kind of religious convictions of the kind that we saw on this slide. And so Wollstonecraft says that if it were true that only one half the human species were rational beings capable of going on to an eternal afterlife, then the way that society were arranged, with women being denied systematically opportunities to develop themselves, then the society would be set up all right. But as we saw, Wollstonecraft denies that there are two kinds of souls. There's only one kind of soul, and they're both capable of going on to heavenly life. And so Wollstonecraft is using that idea, that's kind of foundational premise, that there really is one kind of human soul, to say that it can't be all eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, because women, just as much as men, have an interest in developing their morality. Earthly life, Wollstonecraft thought, was a kind of trial period for heavenly life. And when earthly life denied women the capacity to become moral agents, there was something deeply wrong with the way you're putting your society together. Okay, I've gone over time. Sorry about that. We're out of time. Have a great day. No office hours today, so I will catch up with you guys on Friday. Have a good one.